There is a psalm that has been quietly passed down in Jewish homes for generations. It is not treated as a simple bedtime prayer or a calming bedtime ritual. In many traditions, it is spoken with intention, almost like a form of protection connected to financial well-being. The teaching says that when this psalm is recited 7 times right before sleep, something subtle but real begins to shift in a person's financial flow. It is not dramatic or immediate in a visible way, but people describe changes they cannot easily explain. A sense of pressure begins to ease, and situations that felt stuck start to loosen over time in ways that feel almost untraceable at first. I hesitated before sharing this because it was given to me in a very serious and intentional way by a woman who asked me to treat it with respect. She made me promise not to misuse it or turn it into something careless.
Still, I feel it is meant to reach certain people at a specific time. If you are hearing this, there is a reason. By the end of this, you will begin to understand why financial burdens sometimes feel so persistent, and why there may be a deeper layer to how they begin to shift, especially during the quiet moments before sleep. Think honestly about your nights. Have you ever lain down completely exhausted yet unable to feel peace? Your body is tired, your eyes are heavy, but your mind refuses to slow down. Instead, it starts replaying everything related to money. The bills that are due, the debts that are growing, the credit card balance you try not to look at, or a medical expense you keep postponing mentally. You try to rest, but there is a tightness in your chest that does not allow calm. You calculate and recalculate, trying to make everything fit together in your mind. But no matter how many times you do it, the numbers never seem to resolve into relief.
Maybe you have tried to do everything responsibly. You work hard, you avoid unnecessary spending, and you try to stay disciplined. You are not careless with your money. And yet, at the end of each month, it feels like the income disappears before the responsibilities do. Then you look around and see others who do not seem to struggle in the same way. Some appear less stressed, less burdened, and still seem financially comfortable. That comparison slowly turns into confusion, and eventually into a quiet question you keep asking yourself. Why does it feel like I am constantly trying to catch up while others seem at ease? If this feels familiar, there is something important you need to understand. This is not about you being incapable or irresponsible. It is not about you being somehow broken or destined to struggle. And it is not about punishment or bad fortune in the way people often assume. What you are experiencing may have layers that are not immediately visible. In many spiritual teachings, including those preserved within Jewish tradition, financial struggle is not viewed only as a surface-level issue. It is understood as something that can also reflect a deeper internal or spiritual condition affecting how flow and ease are experienced. Within Jewish wisdom texts, there is an idea that when a person carries debt, something in their spiritual flow becomes restricted. It is described in a way that suggests limitation rather than absence, almost like pressure being placed on a channel that is meant to remain open. When that pressure exists, even consistent effort can feel like it is not producing proportional results. You may increase your work, adjust your habits, or take on more responsibility, yet the sense of relief still feels delayed or incomplete, as if something is quietly restricting the outcome. What makes this even more difficult is how often it affects sincere and hardworking individuals. People who try to do the right thing, who help others when they can, and who live with integrity still find themselves under growing financial strain. Notices arrive, obligations increase, and the cycle continues. On the surface, it seems unfair and confusing. Meanwhile, throughout generations, Jewish communities have often rebuilt stability, even after severe displacement and hardship. Not because struggle did not exist, but because certain practices, disciplines, and spiritual understandings were preserved and carried forward through time. One of those preserved practices involves a specific psalm, spoken with intention during a very sensitive moment of the day, the transition into sleep. It is believed that this moment carries a unique openness, where what is spoken inwardly carries deeper weight. The practice is not about repetition alone, but about timing, awareness, and intention combined. This is where the idea of saying it 7 times comes in, as a way of aligning focus and creating consistency in that final state of the day. The psalm being referred to is Psalm 23. Many people are familiar with its words, often hearing it in emotional or ceremonial settings, which can make it feel familiar but also simplified. However, in this context, it is not being presented as a comforting poem alone. It is being understood on a deeper level, where meaning and intention are just as important as the words themselves. Reciting it without awareness is one thing, but engaging with it intentionally is something entirely different. And that distinction is where its deeper significance is believed to begin. In Jewish interpretation, Psalm 23 is not seen as a soft or comforting passage, but as a strong declaration connected to provision and financial alignment. I first understood this during one of the most difficult periods of my life. I was 34 when everything collapsed after my husband's business suddenly failed. It wasn't a slow decline, it ended almost overnight after one failed deal, and a broken agreement wiped out years of effort. We were left with overwhelming debts from banks, suppliers, and even family members who had trusted us. One night, I sat in my kitchen, staring at a yellow legal pad filled with numbers, and the total at the bottom made it hard to even breathe. That was when my mother-in-law came. She had rebuilt her life from nothing multiple times, and calmly told me that David, when writing Psalm 23, was not speaking from comfort or wealth, but from a place of lack while still declaring abundance through faith. She then explained this psalm through deeper mystical teachings, especially the Zohar, describing it as working through the level called Yesod, understood as the channel through which sustenance enters the physical world. In her view, financial struggle is not only about income or effort, but about a restriction in that flow. She described it like pressure in a pipe. No matter how much is poured in, only a limited amount can pass through. Debt, she explained, is not the root problem, but the visible result of that restriction. Until that moment, I had only seen money issues as practical problems, but she reframed it as something connected to alignment rather than punishment, shifting my understanding from fear and blame to the idea that flow itself can become blocked internally. She instructed me to recite Psalm 23 7 times before sleep, explaining that 7 represents completion in Jewish thought. Creation is described as unfolding in 7 stages. Shabbat is the 7th day of rest, and even the sabbatical year reflects the release of debt cycles. Saying it 7 times, she said, is a way of declaring the end of a cycle, especially cycles of financial pressure. That night, she had me sit at the edge of the bed with open hands and read slowly without rushing. Each line was meant to be felt deeply, not just spoken. When I reached phrases about restoration or abundance, I was told to let them settle inwardly and to picture fullness and overflow not as imagination, but as something shaping reality over time. She also shared the story of Nakdimon Ben Gurion, a wealthy man in Jerusalem who once faced an impossible debt during a severe drought. He had arranged to borrow water and promised repayment, but when the deadline arrived, there was no rain, and the situation seemed hopeless. Instead of panicking or trying to manipulate the outcome, he went to the temple and spoke with complete clarity about his intention, explaining that his actions were not for personal gain, but for a higher purpose. The teaching says that immediately after, rain came and the wells filled beyond expectation, resolving the debt completely. The lesson she emphasized was that provision is not only about effort or strategy, but about alignment with purpose. When intention becomes clear, resistance begins to loosen and flow is restored. She then explained that the psalm itself is only one part of the practice. It opens a kind of channel, but intention is what keeps it from closing again. Before reciting it, she told me to declare that any provision I receive is not only for myself, but also for others. Even a small act of giving, like setting aside a coin as charity, changes the internal position from holding to flowing. In her words, money is not meant to stop with a person, but to move through them. When that understanding shifts, prayer is no longer just about asking for help, but about becoming a vessel through which stability, support, and provision can circulate more freely and consistently. After the war, my mother-in-law arrived in America with absolutely nothing to her name. She had just one change of clothing and worn-out shoes, and she couldn't speak English or rely on any support system. No relatives, no savings, no safety net. Her first job was in a sewing factory where she worked long, exhausting shifts stitching garments for 14 hours a day. When she received her first paycheck, she did something no one around her understood. She divided it into 2 equal parts. One part went to her basic survival needs like rent and food, and the other part she broke into small envelopes for people she knew who were struggling even more than she was. People told her it made no sense to give away so much when she herself had so little, but she believed that withholding everything would close the flow instead of opening it. Over time, her situation began to change in ways that surprised even her. She used to say that giving was not loss, but a form of trust that more would come. That mindset stayed with her through every stage of rebuilding her life. Within a year, she managed to save enough to start a small business. A few years later, she had expanded enough to purchase the property where it stood. 2 decades later, she had become financially stable in a way no one around her could have predicted from her beginning. What stood out most was that she never carried unpayable debt at any point in her life. She believed that something about keeping generosity alive, even in hardship, prevented financial pressure from locking in permanently. To her, money was always meant to move, not to stop. The final layer of what she taught me was about timing, especially the moments before sleep. She explained that in Jewish teaching, sleep is described in the Talmud as a small fraction of death, not as something negative, but as a state where the soul temporarily rises beyond the physical body. During that time, it is believed that the soul moves upward and undergoes a kind of reflection or accounting. Thoughts, actions, and intentions from the day are considered in a spiritual sense, and from that, the direction of the next day is shaped. This is why in texts like the Zohar, sleep is viewed as a period where unseen decisions about one's future conditions are formed. Because of this belief, the state you fall asleep in becomes extremely important. If a person goes to bed overwhelmed with fear, stress, or constant focus on lack, that emotional state is thought to accompany the soul upward. In contrast, when the final moments before sleep are filled with trust, calm intention, and spiritual focus, the inner signal is completely different. The teaching suggests that what the soul carries into that higher state influences what is returned in the form of tomorrow's opportunities, circumstances, and financial flow. In this framework, the night is not passive, but quietly formative. She also connected this idea to the concept of the 7 repetitions. In Kabbalistic tradition, the number 7 represents completion and alignment across different levels of existence. The teachings of the Ari describe the 7 emotional attributes through which spiritual influence descends into physical reality. Each repetition of Psalm 23 is understood as engaging another layer of that structure, moving from higher intention down toward tangible expression. By the 7th repetition, The idea is that the intention has fully passed through all layers and is positioned to manifest in the physical world in a complete way. The practice itself, as she explained it, is simple but deliberate. Before sleep, the space is prepared to be orderly enough to allow calm focus. A small act of giving, even symbolic, is set aside as a reminder of trust and flow. Then the person sits upright at the edge of the bed instead of lying down, taking a moment to steady the mind and release mental pressure with a few slow breaths. A clear intention is spoken about being a channel rather than a container, followed by a slow and mindful recitation of Psalm 23:7 separate times. Only after completing this is the person meant to lie down, allowing those final thoughts to settle as sleep begins. When she reflected on her own life, she often connected her stability back to this mindset rather than isolated events. She believed that what changed everything was not sudden luck, but the removal of internal resistance to flow. Small changes began to appear first, then gradually became consistent patterns of relief and opportunity. Over time, the pressure of debt and lack diminished until it no longer defined her daily experience. She always distinguished between receiving money and releasing financial pressure, saying the real shift was not just income increasing, but the burden itself lifting. In her view, the combination of intention, giving, and timing work together as one continuous system rather than separate actions. Think of it as a message being sent. The psalm is the message itself, carrying the intention of what you are declaring. The act of giving, even something small like charity, becomes the seal that validates it and shows sincerity behind the words. And the moment right before sleep is like handing that message to the system that delivers it upward to where outcomes are formed. If any one part is missing, the process feels incomplete. Without the words, there is no clear declaration. Without giving, there is no proof of trust. Without the timing, the intention loses its alignment. But when all three come together, the teaching suggests that something begins to shift internally, as if the direction of your circumstances is being gently reset from within. There is a teaching in Jewish tradition referenced in the Talmud that a person who falls asleep with sacred words on their lips is accompanied through the night in a protected state. It is described in symbolic language as being guarded during sleep, a time when the soul is considered to rise beyond the physical body. Psalm 23, in this understanding, is not just poetry, but a personal declaration of trust expressed by David in his most vulnerable moments. It speaks of moving through danger, uncertainty, and pressure without losing inner stability. When repeated with intention, it is seen as connecting a person to a long lineage of faith and endurance, where generations before also used these words during hardship, uncertainty, and rebuilding. The idea is that your nighttime state matters more than people realize. In this framework, sleep is not just rest, but a transition point where tomorrow begins forming in subtle ways. Going to sleep with fear, stress, or constant focus on lack is believed to carry that emotional signal into the deeper process of renewal. But shifting that final moment of awareness into trust, intention, and calm focus is seen as changing the internal direction of what follows. The repetition of the psalm is described as reinforcing that shift layer by layer until it settles into a deeper sense of alignment before sleep fully takes over. When all of this is brought together, the message becomes less about ritual and more about mindset, trust, and internal positioning. The combination of intention, generosity, and focused repetition is viewed as a way of changing how a person relates to pressure, rather than simply reacting to it. It is not framed as instant change, but as a gradual loosening of inner tension that affects how circumstances are experienced over time. The closing idea is a reminder of courage in the face of uncertainty, encouraging a shift from fear toward trust, especially in moments when life feels heavy.